Tracking and recovering corrupt assets. That's the topic of this year's Mezhyhirya Investigative Journalism Festival, where we are now. Mezhyhirya is a luxurious residency of former Ukrainian President Yanukovych, who had been ousted. It had been hidden from the public view. It was heavily guarded when he was ruling the country, but now it's open to the public as a museum of corruption. So it's already the 5th year when the best investigative reporter from Eastern and Central Europe gather together to discuss what can be done to keep Europe's corrupt accountable, what the governments can do in order to keep dirty money away. And that's our special edition of the Sunday Show. Anna Babinets is a famous Ukrainian journalist, a regional editor of OCCRP project, and she was here the very next day after Yanukovych had escaped Ukraine. And the place had become open to the public. Later, Anna is and was following what's going on with his money. She is one of the organizers of the festival and the author of the idea to talk about the assets recovery, and that's what we will talk now. Anna, so the public in general, especially international public, would like to know in the very general term. So what happened with Yanukovych assets and with the assets of his team? Has Ukraine managed to get some of them back arrested? So what's going on?
In general, almost anything happened with that, unfortunately. I mean, now we are in Mezhyhirya. It's very big asset of Yanukovych. It was his residence, as we know, and it's under arrest now, but people from NGO is managing it. So a state still doesn't have anything here, so it's very big, and state can do something, Ukraine can do something with this, but now it's like, it's the same like it was 4 years ago when Yanukovych escaped. It was like nobody's land, yeah, and now it's the same. We know case about our general prosecutors. They like to talk about 1.5 billion of confiscated money, which according to our general prosecutor Lutsenko, this money belonged to Yanukovych, but actually it's not true. This money connects to Kurchenko. This is young oligarch who lives in Moscow now, but he never been official. And it's like, I don't know how general prosecutors, how they can to link this 1.5 billions to Yanukovych. I can't see any connection actually. So maybe something, maybe some small things which were arrested by general prosecutors or police, but actually we almost don't know about that. We know a lot about these assets, but we don't know anything about arrested or...
Any other people from Yanukovych team, formal and informal, had their money had been arrested, brought back to the Ukrainian public, and what's going on?
This is the question too. We were trying to figure out with that before this fest, and we were creating documentary about that, about how it's going after 4 years, and we have several stories about ministers, former ministers who were ministers when Yanukovych was president, and we have some cases. They are still going, as we know, in any criminal cases, people, these former ministers, former officials, we don't have anybody who convinced for something, yeah. And there are some assets which were arrested. It's some apartments, some cars. We know about case of Klimenko. He is former minister of duty, and there are some cars which were arrested by Arma, and Arma sold them.
Arma is?
Yeah, Arma is new agency which started to work only last autumn. Each special agency which should manage assets which have some corruption roots. So for us, as for journalists, it's interesting and important to understand what is it, how it works, and now we see that they manage some assets which connect to Klemenko. This is that Gulliver.
This is the business center.
Yeah, this business center, several floors there were arrested, and now ARMA, this agency, they try to manage it. And I don't know how much money they can get from it, but it's just, at least this process is starting. The process when these assets just staying and nothing happening with them. And now this service, this agency is trying at least to get some money from these assets. But it's not a lot. Actually, I don't know any big successful story about that.
Investigative journalists today are often in the public discourse, which is here in Ukraine, accused of speaking too negative on anything that's happened, being too critical, and that's the discourse even by some of the Western partners. But indeed, how do you see the new agencies which are created? Are they not corrupt? Do you trust them? And not to build this relation on we trust or not trust. Yeah. What are the facts and figures to know? Should we be optimistic? Should we be pessimistic? What is working? What is not?
Actually, I'm pretty optimistic about working of NABU. But I don't know how it happened. But all cases about former officials is investigating by people from general prosecutors. NABU doesn't have these cases. I don't know why, who decided it, but actually it's corrupted assets too, and NABU should work on it too, as I understand. But actually NABU doesn't work with these assets. If we are talking about assets of former officials who escaped and left here some houses, cars, everything, it's only general prosecution cares about it. Only they investigate it. So if we are talking about this subject, we can talk only about general prosecutors, not about NABU, ARMA, and ARMA. Yeah, ARMA sometimes manages assets, but important thing that ARMA can't decide what they will manage, what not. They can do only after court decision or after some decision of prosecutors. They can, for example, court decided that this Mezhyhirya should be managed by ARMA. Yeah? So ARMA can't make any decision without court and without investigators from general prosecutors. So that's new. I hope that it will work. Really, now I believe in ARMA, but we'll see how it will work. And they absolutely depends on decisions of general prosecutors.
And in any country after the revolution, there are the talks and there are the numbers of conspiracy theories that the current government cooperate with the previous government, because it's always there are the same people, that's everywhere. So really, do you have some evidence that indeed the cases are not investigated because of some hidden deals, or at least where we have the real reason to suspect that there is a deal?
Actually, we are, as journalists, have it, and we have found some evidences of some agreements between, some negotiations and agreements between former officials and current officials. For example, the case we presented recently, this about Stavitsky. Eduard Stavitsky was Minister of Energetic when Yanukovych was president, and he ran away from Ukraine after Yanukovych, and now he lives in Israel. He has Israeli passport, and we got Следство.info got some evidence, some audio records and video records about meeting in Israel between Stavitsky and two deputies of general prosecutor, Angela Strizhevskaya and Yevgen Yenin, that they met in hotel room, which doesn't look like some official place for negotiation. And we have this audio records about talking that representatives of general prosecution proposed him. They talked about his criminal case and what they can do in this case. Can they make any agreement in it. So at least we have a fact of meeting outside of Ukraine. We don't know did they make any agreement in the end. We know about fact of this meeting, we know about some negotiation, and it looks like for us it looks like some cooperation, because in general representatives of prosecutors they in all talking we have 1 hour discussion between the people. It looked like they wanted to help him to solve with his criminal case. I mean, to make it's not so strong, or to help him to be not so bad or something. So it looked like that. We suspect that general prosecutors may ask about something in return for this good relationships, for trying to make good relationships with former minister, yeah. And we are waiting for comments, we are waiting for some explanation from officials what it was. If it was official meeting, it didn't look like that, and we for sure request the general prosecutor about this visit, about everything, so we are waiting. But now we think if about your question, I think that now we have some evidences that these meetings and these attempts of connecting between former officials and current officials, we can see that it happened.
How Russia hides its dirty money in the United Kingdom. Are the unexplained wealth order and the anti-money laundering bill working? British investigative reporter and the author Oliver Bullough tells us more.
So it's been 4 years since former President Yanukovych has been ousted and he fled Ukraine for Russia. Other members of former government have also been removed from their position. Last time we spoke, you said, it was I think in 2014 and 2015, you said there has been no progress on recovering those frozen corrupt assets. Can you talk me through what's happened since, if there has been any progress?
Well, there has been progress in changing the law. Obviously, Ukraine has created NABU, the Anti-Corruption Bureau, which has been good. Ukraine has brought drug procurement, went to international agencies instead of being run by the health ministry, which helped reduce prices and reduce corruption. That's very good. Procurement has become much more transparent. These are all very good and very important things in terms of preventing corruption in future. I mean, it's still very fragile and it's very difficult to know how well this will last. But it's, you know, these are important steps, and I think that Ukrainians can be very pleased with some of the progress that's been made. But specifically, you were asking about the recovery of stolen assets, and this is an enormous amount of money was stolen from Ukraine. We don't know exactly how much, but obviously billions of dollars. Progress on recovering that has been very, very slow. But I think that partly after 2014 and the revolution, there was expectations or hopes that this money would be seized in Switzerland, in Latvia, in the UK, and returned to Ukraine very quickly, where it could help, you know, fund the army or build roads or fund hospitals and so on. I think a lot of those hopes were very unrealistic. If you look at the case of Pavlo Lazarenko, who was Prime Minister in the 1990s, he was arrested in California, jailed in America. He was out of jail. He's out of jail. He's still in America. This all happened. I mean, he was arrested almost 20 years ago, 18, 19 years ago, and they still haven't managed to confiscate his money and return it to Ukraine. That happened 2 decades ago. So the process is incredibly difficult and incredibly complicated because, partly because it involves many different countries. These are court cases happening all over the world in many different countries simultaneously, and also because these people are very rich, and rich people can hire the best lawyers, and the best lawyers are very good at delaying things. So I mean, there has been essentially no progress in recovering assets outside Ukraine that belong to, you know, the insiders from the Yanukovych regime. But it was probably unrealistic to imagine there would be progress. This takes, if it happens at all, it takes decades.
So moving on to Russia, on which you of course are an expert, The United Kingdom has been known unofficially as the haven for Russian oligarchs and their
Officially as well, probably.
and their money, which is probably like not really earned in completely legal or transparent ways. Recently, it seems like the UK has been trying to change that, and they have introduced some new things like the UWO, the unexplained wealth orders, and the sanction and anti-money laundering bill, which has become a law just weeks ago. And I mean, it might be connected or not, but Roman Abramovich has also been, I mean, it's not completely sure, like for sure yet, but he's either been denied or just not given the visa, which might be connected to this whole sort of crackdown on Russian oligarchs. Can you tell us whether these things are actually changing, whether it's going to become tougher for Russian oligarchs in London and UK in general?
So it's not just Russian oligarchs. We're very open to any oligarchs. So we don't, I mean, we like Russian oligarchs obviously, but also Nigerians, Chinese, Malaysian. I mean, and from anywhere, Kazakhstan, Ukraine. I mean, it isn't a Russian thing. I mean, we just happen to like money in general. So. But there has definitely been a shift certainly in rhetoric in the UK in the last 5 years. We recognise, I think, more than we used to, the damage that this money is doing, the theft of this money from its original countries is doing, and we also recognise the damage it's doing in our own country in terms of making everything more expensive and driving inequality and so on. So, yes, there has been a change. There has been, some. Things are much more transparent than they used to be, and as you say, unexplained wealth orders, which will allow police to confiscate property without having a criminal conviction in a new way. That may change things, but this is very early days. None of them have been tested in court yet, really, so we don't know if it'll actually lead to anything. Hope dies last, but experience perhaps maybe would suggest that we need to be a bit cautious. Normally, nothing ever changes. In Britain is a centre for laundering dirty money. We're good at it, and normally our bankers just find a new way of doing it.
Right, and I mean, some good news from Ukraine as well. Like you probably know that we have just adopted a law on the anti-corruption court.
Yes.
Which has been much anticipated by Ukraine's activists and also by Ukraine's international partners around the world. However, questions still remain how much in compliance it is with international standards. Would you say it's happy days for Ukraine now, or is it still a long sort of battle to fight?
Well, I sort of think the way you need to look at it is to say, well, we're not, Ukraine isn't Sweden yet. That would be nice if it was suddenly to become Sweden, but I think that's not likely to happen. So you need to think of it as every little win is a win. So the anti-corruption court, it's not perfect, but it's still better than not having an anti-corruption court at all. So it's something to build on. So you might be, at sort of 25% Sweden, right? But that's better than being 5% Sweden. So I don't know, I think it's good. I think all of these little gains that Ukraine has been making about outsourcing medical procurement to the UN and the Crown agents, to bringing in the Prozoro procurement system, all these things are good. And opening up the company registration data, it's all, every single one of these is a victory, and I think Ukraine should be very pleased with that. But it's still only 25%. It's a long way to go. I mean, and some of these people need to go to jail. None of these people have gone to jail. It's none of this money has been confiscated. I mean, the help that Ukrainian prosecutors have been able to show, their colleagues in Latvia and colleagues in the United States, colleagues in the UK, has been really inadequate. And Ukrainian prosecutors need to be much better at their job if they're going to have any hope of putting these people in prison and taking their money away, because that's the only thing that actually at the end will change anything.
Do we know much about the law itself? Because I know there have been discussions whether it's satisfying all these demands that have been put forward by the international partners. How much is known about this?
I think we need to wait to see what the International Monetary Fund say. Right. They tend to be the ones, they can be a bit flexible, but we'll have to wait and see what they say. If they think it's enough, then that will be interesting. I know that it certainly could be a lot worse, so maybe that's the attitude they'll take. And so hopefully they'll think it's okay, because Ukraine still needs that money from the IMF.
Okay. And I believe it's been like less than 24 hours still that this news broke out on new charges against Donald Trump's former aide Paul Manafort, and for the first time about his associate Konstantin Klivnik. I think we haven't heard anything about it since February. And Klivnik was of course born in Ukraine, but he reportedly has ties with Russian intelligence. So do you think these new charges are likely to help the case move along, and how willing is Ukraine to help investigate this case? Because there have been several stories in different foreign publications like saying that Poroshenko has been given javelins in exchange for sort of stopping this case and not investigating further.
It can be very difficult to tell in the experience of certainly of people I've spoken to about whether Ukrainian prosecutors are actually trying to help or not. Because the help that they provide can be so substandard anyway that it's difficult to tell whether they're being obstructive or helpful. This case with the missiles and stopping the investigation, I certainly have no reason to believe that that isn't true. But then I'm not sure how much help Ukraine would have been able to provide anyway, because they don't tend to be very good at helping people. So in the prosecutor's office. I mean, this is interesting, the Manafort things, but I mean, it looks to me that it's just a little bit of a much bigger picture, and maybe we shouldn't think too much about Manafort, because actually the big stuff is obviously Trump and his family and what they're getting up to, and Manafort's a little bit of a sideshow.
Russian oligarchs are buying their right to live in Britain. Will recent tensions between the state change this? We talk to Transparency International's Rachel Davies.
Transparency International has released a report on this recently, and you have identified something like 176 properties, and that's just properties alone, with an estimated $4.4 billion of what is believed to be purchased with what is believed to be stolen wealth. A fifth of those properties allegedly belong to Russian citizens, and Ukraine is actually not that far behind, with more than 700 million invested into these properties. Can you tell us about the extent of Russian wealth in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, the UK, it is a centre of Russian money laundering, essentially. And you mentioned this £4.4 billion figure. I think what's really important to note is that is just the tip of the iceberg, because this figure is what we found just by looking at open source material, so court documents, land registry documents, the leaks from the Paradise and Panama Papers. If it wasn't for those leaks, we wouldn't know about this at all. So the real figure, because so much of this is hidden, the real figure is probably much higher. As you said, we found £4.4 billion worth of money bought with suspicious wealth, and a fifth of that is from Russia. There was a Deutsche Bank research report a few years ago that estimated that about £100 billion had flowed out of Russia secretly. Now, unfortunately, we don't know exactly how much of that has arrived in Britain because of the nature of the problem. So much of this happens secretly. For example, if you had millions of pounds, I don't know if you do, you could buy a property in London anonymously. You could open a company in the British Virgin Islands. You don't have to put your name on it. Now, when you buy that property in London, you don't even have to tell UK authorities who you really are.
That figure of, I think it was something like over $900 million of what is suspected to be stolen money invested in UK property, that's just real estate alone. Do you have an estimation or even an idea of how much stolen money lies in other UK assets?
We don't have a figure because of the nature of the problem, but we do know that money has been flowing into other sectors such as education or luxury goods, or art, for example. Art and auction houses in the UK are very vulnerable to money laundering because the people that work there just aren't equipped to do the due diligence on their clients. And of course, art can carry, a single painting can carry a lot of wealth. It's a way to launder a lot of money in one transaction. We do, however, of course, have some figures around the property market, and that has been particularly problematic. I think of one property that's just a 5-minute walk from Parliament. It's owned by someone very high up in the Russian government who earns roughly £112,000 a year. This property, actually it's 2 properties, we reckon are worth between 11 and 15 million. So this person, this politician, would have to save every single penny of his salary for 100 years. not spend any of it for 100 years in order to afford this property, which of course raises the question, well, where did this money come from?
And also your report outlines how a lot of this money is used to purchase visas under what is, I believe, called the Golden Visa Scheme. And there's been recent reports and recent there's been recent articles about this, and it talks about how Russians are some of the biggest investors in this Golden Visa Scheme, which basically allows them to invest large amounts of money in UK assets, and that then gives them the permission to reside and even later on get citizenship in the UK. Can you tell us about that scheme? And as far as I understand it, it's completely legal. How does it work, and how many Russians are estimated to have purchased visas or citizenships through this scheme in the UK?
Sure, so the UK's Golden Visa Scheme was set up in 2008, and for the first 7 years of its operation, it didn't have any anti-money laundering checks, which is really worrying for us. So the Home Office would grant the visa with the promise of investment. So they'd grant the visa before the money had been put into a UK bank account, expecting that the banks, the financial institutions, would do the anti-money laundering checks, right? Of course, when the money came into the financial institutions, if they had some suspicions over the person that was applying and the source of their wealth, they'd say, hang on, the Home Office has just granted them a visa. I'm sure it's fine, they must be legit. And they wouldn't do any of the enhanced due diligence checks. Now, 3,000 people in total applied for a visa between what we call the blind faith periods, that's 2008 to 2015, bringing in a minimum of £3 billion. 23% of those people were Russian. The only group of individuals that beats the Russian contingent was individuals from China. How it works is if you have £2 million, you promise to and put it in a UK bank account for a while, you can take it out later, and then you can apply for permanent residency within 5 years. Now, if you're even richer and you can put in £10 million, you can apply for permanent residency within 2 years. So the reason we think as well that this scheme was used to launder money is because when the government introduced the money laundering checks in 2015, the number of applications dropped sharply. Which gives us real cause for concern.
And earlier this year, obviously there was the widely reported incident where a former Russian intelligence officer, Sergei Skripal, and his daughter Yulia were poisoned, which prompted the UK to take action, and that led to diplomatic expulsions. Is this expected to have an impact on the amount of Russian wealth flowing through the UK and the number of Russian citizens gaining visas and citizenship through the scheme?
It's a very interesting question. I think only time will tell. I have seen some noises in London from some lawyers, for example, that work with Russian citizens saying, oh, now you're bringing in some of these measures, Russians won't come here. So, for example, they often cite something called an unexplained wealth order, which is where the UK law enforcement can go to an individual who may be a politician from overseas or has links to serious crime, and their known income is really not enough to buy the massive mansions that they're buying in London. They could say, please explain to us the source of your wealth. And this was something that came into force after this diplomatic crisis, although it was already on track to happen. What's interesting is lots of people are saying right now Russians aren't going to come here. What's interesting about that is that tools like this cannot actually be used as a political football. They can only be used against people who are either involved in corruption or serious crime. So it's interesting that there's this noise of Russian individuals are going to be leaving. Either they've misunderstood the law, or some of them are involved in serious crime and corruption, and that's why they're worried about this.
The unexplained wealth order is something that Transparency International has been calling for. What kind of long-term impacts do you expect this to have on Russian money laundering in the UK?
Well, before we had the unexplained wealth order, our law enforcement were really dependent in order to seize an asset, in order to seize a property, either on a conviction for that person in their origin state, a conviction of corruption or serious crime, or enough information coming from the law enforcement in that origin state. Now, obviously in many countries, convictions for corruption sometimes don't come about for decades or ever, particularly if a country is in crisis or a country has a government within which a lot of corruption happens, right? And in terms of sharing information, unfortunately, dirty money can cross borders unhindered, police can't. So they're really reliant on the right information coming from the law enforcement in that country. And we've seen in certain cases, you know, the allegations that bribes have been paid to that law enforcement to stop them giving the information to the British police. So their hands were kind of tied in terms of being able to build up enough evidence to take to the court. Now, what the unexplained wealth order does is it gives police an opportunity to build further evidence. So let's say I'm the health minister, country outside Europe, and my annual salary is $30,000 and I've just bought two £10 million mansions, and there's nothing in my asset declarations to suggest I could afford that. Law enforcement can now come to me and say, hey, look, huge gap between your income and your asset. Maybe it's fine, just show us proof of the legitimate income, show us what we've missed here. If I can do that, they're like, okay. If I'm unable to do that, they can use the fact that I cannot explain where this wealth came from as additional evidence that they can then take to a High Court judge and potentially seize the assets. So I'm really hoping if the UK government implements this law and uses it wisely and uses it well, that we'll see more assets being seized, and therefore the UK won't be seen as such an easy place, which it is at the moment. It won't be seen as such an easy place to hide your money if it's dirty. And I hope that'll mean we'll see less dirty money coming in and more assets being seized and returned to the Russian citizens, returned to citizens of Ukraine and citizens around the world from which this money has been stolen from in the first place.
And Theresa, following the Skripal attack, Theresa May, the UK Prime Minister, said that some 700 Russian citizens have come through this visa scheme, and they are looking at reviewing the visa scheme itself. What kind of is it going to have an impact on the people that are already there, and what kind of an impact can it have on Russians who are wanting to use the scheme to come into the UK in the future?
So in terms of impact, so we are calling on the government at Transparency International, we are calling them to look not just at the 700 Russians, but the 3,000 people that came through the system between 2008 and 2015 where there are no money laundering checks done. Now, Theresa May said very briefly there'll be a review. We've written to the Home Secretary a couple of months ago saying, please give us more information. Will this look at the golden visa part of this? Will you look at the people that came through in the blind faith period? So far we've heard nothing back. So I am not yet reassured they will really properly review this. The question is still out on that. In terms of Russians coming in future, I think I think it's fine for Russian citizens to come to the UK if they got legitimate, honestly gained money, if they're not involved in corruption or crime. And now that there are further money laundering checks in place, yes, I hope it will deter and put off those that will be bringing corrupt money and have a history of criminal activity. I hope they will be put off from coming, but I also hope that honest Russian citizens that have hard-earned, honest money won't be put off from coming to the UK, and that they will still feel welcome.
How family ties and dodgy procurement system fuel corruption in Belarus energy sector. Stanislav Ivashkevich has talked about his investigation which led to ministerial dismissal. He is the business reporter for Belsat, Belarusian independent television.
I understand you've just had your investigation published on the Belarus energy monopolies. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Before we get into that, it's important to stress one thing about Belarus, which is very different from Ukraine. In Belarus, you get very little, if any, documents published at all. So even companies that are listed on Belarus Stock Exchange, they are supposed to publish their financial statements. However, they publish very short versions of them of profit and loss statement and a balance sheet. The atmosphere is much different from what you have in Ukraine. You cannot, officially, legally, you cannot get any data, you cannot get anything. You cannot get permission to go anywhere, and you cannot get interviews. I'm an economics reporter, so I also have an investigative program, so I did a few economic stories on our utilities prices going up, so I started digging into why they're going up, and there was this thing that the state said that, okay, the utility prices were subsidized until now, but we're going to have to bring them to 100% of cost recovery, because this is market after all, so we're going to have to face the truths of life. But what I found, however, is that as it was, the prices were going up, but the percentage in the long term, and also in our utility bills, it says the percentage which we cover by paying, and the rest is paid by the state. So that percentage in the long run did not change really. It decreased when the utility prices went up, and then there are oil price fluctuations and so on, and then you find yourself a year later with utility prices 50% higher, and the percentage of cost recovery pretty much the same as before. So I started getting into that and talking to sources, and the usual investigative stuff. You look out for competitors you ask them about each other, you look out for people who got fired and who are angry, and concerned citizens, and they started telling me a story, and the picture was building up about the fact what was very surprising to me is that in Belarus a lot of things are state-owned. 50% of the economy is state-owned companies, and it was believed that the all Belarus energy system is also state-owned. I found out, however, during this investigation that half of them are private already. And in spite of being privatized, in spite of being private and being owned by various both Belarusian and foreign businessmen, and also by offshore companies, they still retain the monopoly status in the Belarus energy sector. So, not officially. They retain this monopoly through manipulation of tenders by the officials of the Ministry of Energy in Belarus. And sometimes, if they can't manipulate it, they just give the work to them, and then they don't tell any other competitors who took part in the bidding process why. So basically these companies were enjoying a complete practical monopoly, and using that monopoly to charge the state 3 to 4 times the prices that the market would charge in Belarus. This was the information we got, and we started getting into documents, how to prove that. So we played a bidding process. We pretended we were a company who wants to do that. So you don't, these parts of energy infrastructure you also have in private factories. Sometimes they build their own little energy infrastructure, so not to be dependent on the state for energy, and because the price of that energy is high. So we pretended we were one of these factors, and we got like dozens of price offers. All of them were 3 to 4 times lower. We published that, and we also found that some of the companies are owned by offshore companies in Lithuania and Russia, and we also found that there are links between management of these private companies and officials in the Ministry of Energy. They're related, father and son, and so on. So we published that investigation, and we indicated that there might be signs of corruption there. Another thing in Belarus that you can only, the law is such that, and the judicial practice is that you can only say corruption if there was a state prosecutor or a court convicting somebody of corruption. Otherwise, you cannot say corruption.
Sorry, who filed the court case against you?
One of these private monopolies.
Can you say which one?
The Ministry of Energy. It's called Belkotla Очистка, which stands for Belarus. I don't know how to translate it. It's all the electricity and heat is produced by boilers, right? So they're in charge of, and each of these boilers, there are like thousands of them around the country, and each one of these boilers has to be cleaned annually or biannually. And it costs like $50,000 to $100,000, and so they clean all these boilers, all these power generating things. I don't know how to say it in English, the particular word. So yes, so it was one of these companies, Belkotla Очистка. They filed a court case against me, saying that I said they're corrupt and they're not corrupt. And they were trying to, however, the court surprisingly did not just say, okay, so no previous ruling on this, so you're guilty. The court decided to get into that and to actually figure out what's going on. So there were, as I said, there were like 4 sessions where we're bringing more and more and more documents, and they were bringing more documents. So, so there was this battle going on, and after. In between one of these sessions, I realized also that apart from charging high prices, that these companies also sometimes don't even do the work that they get paid for, and very high likelihood that they bribe the Ministry of Energy officials and other officials. How did I find out that? So one of the sources said that when they part of this work is disposing of waste. So it's when you clean one average size reservoir, you can get 100 tons of petroleum products waste, which are no longer used, which are no use anymore for heating. So you have to dispose of them by taking them to a specialized facility with put chemicals into them and go through this lengthy process of making them clean so they can be disposed or reused. For cleaning each of these reservoirs, they get like $50,000 to dispose of that waste. And so source told me that they don't even bother disposing of it, they dig it into the ground. And he said, and the Ministry of Energy officials who overlook that power generating facilities, I called them up, I asked, did you really, is that what happened? They said no. So, and it could not have been true, as I found out later. Okay, so I get to that first. So what we did was we went to that power generating facility, and the way they were getting away with it is it's closed territory. Nobody's allowed to go in. It's covered by 2 fences with like barbed wire, so we climbed we found weak spots to climb through it, and we realized like there was this huge field behind the power generating facility and the office building overlooking it, and in between that field is a huge fuel oil swamp, which was, according to the source, and as we found out later through other documents, which was 100 tons of fuel just dug into the ground. So we actually literally had to run to that swamp, hoping that they will not see us from the window, quickly dig it up, film it, and then run back, hoping they don't notice. We were lucky they did not notice, but generally if you sit in that office the whole day, there is no way you can overlook that, right? It's it's black on yellow.
And what about the ministry? The Minister of Energy said they were.
Oh yes, Minister of Energy is being charged with corruption. The head of the minister.
So he has already been charged.
The charge has not been. There were not no charges put officially yet, but he was arrested and his property was arrested, and it's still under the process of investigation. In fact, the courts, I don't think the court started yet, because it only happened like a few months ago, and they're still in the process of that.
And what's happening with the rest? As far as I understand, yes, these people have been charged. Some people are, there's inspections happening. But you were saying that the schemes are still taking place. So those practices are still very much in place.
The practices are still in place, and my personal belief, which I'm still looking to prove or disprove, but is that. Those were punished, well, first of all, because it had public outcry. So these videos from our TV on YouTube, they had a huge amount of views and were republished. So the government, in fact, we have that dictator, right, as a head of state, so he had to do something. So he started coming out with, he himself started criticizing the energy sector on TV for corruption, and he announced a few of these loud cases that he said, I ordered the arrest of this guy and the arrest of that guy. But my belief is that it's first of all, they're like sacrifice lambs, the few of them, of those that got charged.
Unlimited political power leads to business success. That's exactly the case for Tajikistan, one of the poorest countries in Central Asia, which is becoming a new North Korea. Why? Knows more Ilya Lazovsky, a regional editor of the OCCRP project, who has run the investigation on the country.
Tajikistan is one of the most poorest Central Asian countries, and it's been under the dictatorship of President Rahman. The recent OCCRP discovery has shown that all the corruption ties go to the family of the president. So can you tell us exactly how bad it is?
Well, it's really bad. I think this is basically has been known that the country of Tajikistan is under the rule of this president and his family, and that they take everything, every business that grows above a certain point, they take it for themselves. I think what our investigation shows is the mechanisms, some of the mechanisms behind how this works. And basically, it's a very sad situation. It removes any incentives for local people to try to grow their business, to build something big. It makes them want to leave. Many go to Russia, many go to Turkey or other countries, because if you remain in the country, any business that you build will eventually be seen and then swiped by some member of the ruling family. And in the case of our story, we focused on the son-in-law of the president, a man named Shamsullo Sahibov, who married one of the president's daughters and then built a business empire. And we show how he built that empire step by step with assistance of various kinds from the government. And we also show the fates of some of the people who either stood in his way or tried to point the way towards a different kind of Tajikistan. So it's really a story both about corruption and about growing wealth through using the power of the state. It's also a story about foreign involvement in these schemes, and it's a story about the victims of this kind of system.
There's no any kind of opposition in Tajikistan. So as far as I know, there was this Islam Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, which was nominally opposing the president through all these years. So what exactly happened to them?
Well, this is a very interesting story because Tajikistan, as you mentioned, is it's the poorest former Soviet republic, probably the least developed in several metrics, and very authoritarian. So it's not an environment where you would expect a really strong, robust opposition. But in fact, for a long time, it had an opposition party that was maybe one of the most, I don't know about effective, because of course they didn't have political power, but one of the most legitimate and rooted in the grassroots of any former Soviet republic. Many other former Soviet countries had sort of liberal, elite-based opposition parties in the 90s through today that, had some support maybe in the cities among the most educated, but not really among the wide population. And this is what makes the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan different, because it really is based on a completely different foundation. Its roots are in an Islamic underground movement that was started way back during the Soviet era. And after the civil war in Tajikistan in the 90s, it became a recognized opposition party. And it had representatives in distant villages, every region, and it was almost more like a community movement, like a religious organization, more than a sort of traditional Western political party. But it really helped people. It tried to show people that a different kind of politics was possible. That's what was interesting about it, is it was trying to show Tajikistan that there is another way to govern this country in a way that the people can help determine their own future. But in 2015, after several years of gradually tightening repression, eventually when the party opposed some proposed constitutional changes that would make the president above the constitution, it was shut down. And in a matter of months in that year, it was just through arrests, through intimidation, through torture, through exile, the whole structure was dismantled. And today, its former activists are across the world, living in different countries. They have political asylum in various European countries, and those that weren't able to escape or remained in the country for whatever reason, most have been imprisoned, and so the party's activities basically shut down.
I would like to address one of the most recent and brutal cases with the opposition leaders, such as Umar Likovatov, who was brutally murdered, shot in the streets of Istanbul. Why do you think he was so dangerous for Tajikistan that they just approached him abroad in exile?
Well, I want to say that we don't know exactly who killed him. His supporters, his family, they very strongly insist that it was some representatives of the regime. It's hard to say exactly who may have ordered it or what. But yes, he was pursued across the world after being chased out of Tajikistan. He was imprisoned several times at the request of the Tajik government. The Tajik government, as you say, came out very strongly against him. And I think it's because they really just are that frightened of a loud opposition voice that tells people the truth. And he, while he was abroad after leaving the country, he was very vocal he bought time on television while he was in Russia, and he tried to get, and he put videos on YouTube, and he tried to get his opposition to the regime into Tajikistan. There's a great little anecdote that we include in one of the stories. A Western researcher was in Tajikistan, and his cleaning lady was in the apartment, and sent on the TV a program by Umar Ali Kuvatov came on where he was talking about, you know, the authoritarianism of the president and how the president is leading the country in the wrong direction. And he remembers that the cleaning lady froze, and for her it was like seeing God criticized on TV for the first time. This is the environment that has been built in Tajikistan. It's the leader of the Islamic Renaissance Party told me that it's like North Korea. You know, people only see that Tajikistan is safe, the president keeps you safe. Everywhere else in the world is chaos. Everywhere else with religious opposition parties, Islamic parties, is just terrorism and extremism. Here in Tajikistan, everything is different. So to have that little crack into that facade that Umar Ali Kuvatov tried to provide was very threatening for the regime, and that's why they came after him, I think.
So till these days, Tajikistan is a part of OSCE, and it's also in the program of EU partnership. So if it's really turning into North Korea, as you said, do you think the Western governments should act somehow to stop this process, or how is it possible that the country that is becoming so closed and so authoritarian is still a part of the Western values?
Well, this is a great question. I'm not sure that Western governments can do all that much about what happens inside Tajikistan, but certainly one thing they could do is stop legitimizing the government as a legitimate member of the international community on the same level as other much more democratic countries. The human rights abuses we point to in our stories and the economic crimes, I mean, all kinds of crimes that take place there are so completely blatant and so outrageous that it really should be something that Western governments are speaking about when they speak to Tajikistan and when they speak about Tajikistan. As you mentioned, though, it's an upstanding member of these Western organizations, and I think often Western governments are reluctant to criticize a quote-unquote friendly dictator. You know, Tajikistan is small, it's far away, not a lot of people really take up the cause of Tajikistan in the West. Most people don't know that much about it, so I think that's why that's why we have that situation that Western governments feel free to collaborate with the government, to treat it maybe not as an equal, but as a legitimate partner. And the people of Tajikistan who suffer under this regime, I think it's hard for them to understand.
During this investigation of yours, how hard was it for you to work in Tajikistan to obtain some information, and did you ever feel that you were endangered?
You know, even citizens inside the country who try to access the business registry sometimes find that they're questioned by the security services. So in this case, it relied a lot on interviews with people from the country, with people who interacted with them. With this, we interviewed the mining executive who paid a so-called success fee to a company belonging to the son-in-law of the president in order to try to obtain a mining license. And we could see the files of that company because it's registered on the London Alternative Stock Exchange, and it's a Western company, so it has some requirements for publishing things. So we kind of have to work around the fact that Tajikistan is really one of the most secretive countries and really one of the most difficult countries in the world to report from.
American professor Cheryl Reed's research investigative journalism in post-Soviet countries. We discuss the difference in the access to documents, the results of these investigations to the corrupt officials, and the mechanism to bring them into justice.
You've already been to Belarus and Ukraine, and you talked here with one of the best investigative journalists. What are their main concerns here?
They report on corruption and repeatedly report on corruption, draw a line in the, a map, here's the documents, here are how these people are connected, and yet nothing happens. And I have to say, if that happened to me in the United States when I was working on stories, I would be incredibly frustrated. The other thing is that it's dangerous, and they have to watch if they're being followed. They're frustrated with the Pavel Sheremet investigation. I think that I don't think that they liked how SBU manipulated the Babchenko situation. So I think that they constantly feel like they're under the gun, and yet no one's paying attention or responding to the corruption that they're pointing out. And I think, in my opinion, that investigative reporting needs to get more out in this country on the local level. There's so much having been done about Poroshenko and about Poroshenko colleagues that I think, in my opinion, a lot of readers and viewers have become numb to it. They expect it. And the other thing is that a lot of the investigative reporting doesn't show you what happens as a result of this corruption. So all these millions or billions of dollars that are stolen, well, they're stolen from the people of Ukraine. So that money is not going for education. That money is not going to hospitals. That money is not going to healthcare or medicine. And I think there needs to be a much bigger push to show who the true victims are of this corruption.
So in terms of, for instance, opening this court registers, court files, like who should push for that? Because obviously the government is not interested in doing that, and maybe people do not know that this is possible because the culture is different. But who should really vote for this?
I think the reporters should, and I think the activists of victims should. And usually those are the two people who use these court documents the most. I mean, it's possible that lawyers could, lawyers associations, but I think that they probably already have some access, so that's probably not in their interest. But I do think that reporters, I'm under the impression that the reporters, the investigative reporters that I've talked to in Ukraine don't necessarily see the need, because they figured out some workarounds.
So, to your opinion, what is the biggest challenge for Ukrainian investigative journalism today?
I think there's been so many years of corruption stories that I think the citizens have become almost immune to it, or feeling apathetic, as though there's nothing, they have no power. And so I think investigative journalists have to re-inspire the residents, the citizens of Ukraine, that they can do something, that it's not futile.
Ukrainian investigative journalists, at most, are always facing this situation when, after discovering something within the government or within our politician or like our security service, for instance, we face a lot of critique from the officials because being in the state of war with Russia, we're being said that we serve Russia's interests in this. We shouldn't discourage such things like that and report them to people. How did journalists have to react to such critiques?
I think they have to tell the truth. I mean, that's the #1 rule of being a journalist, right? Maybe also number 1 too is question authority. So in this country, the government is authority, and your job as the journalist is to question the authority and tell the truth. Now, there are certain cases when you probably shouldn't reveal certain things. If it's an issue of national security, if it's going to affect war patterns, or how they're going to execute some sort of strategy, of course, you wouldn't reveal those sorts of things. But any criticism of the government just makes the government better. It's not tearing down the government. It's trying to build a more open society and a more open government, and all that is great.
Thank you from the entire Hromadske International team for watching the special edition of the Sunday show from Mezhyhirya. Hopefully we'll be back next year, if not with the less corruption in Europe, but at least the better recovery asset results.